He told her she was nothing without him. He told her she was invisible, a ghost in his successful life. When Mark Sterling walked out on his wife, Elena, he thought he was discarding a broken toy. He thought she would fade away into poverty and silence. He was wrong. Fast forward 2 years. Mark is desperate, and Elena is no longer the woman he left behind. But when he corners her in a dark alley, expecting her to beg, he doesn't realize who is watching from the shadows. He thought she had no one. He's about to meet the army that protects her. This is the story of betrayal, revenge, and the billionaire who waited for her to rise. The sound of a marriage ending wasn't a scream. In Elena Vance's experience, it was the click of a Toomey suitcase latch. It was a wet Tuesday in November, the kind of Boston evening where the fog rolled off the harbor and choked the streets of Back Bay, turning the brownstones into grey fortresses. Inside their condo, a sprawling minimalist space that felt more like an art gallery than a home, Mark stood by the door. He was checking his reflection in the hallway mirror, adjusting the knot of his silk tie. "I've left the paperwork on the island," Mark said. He didn't look at her. He was looking at his own hairline, ensuring it was perfect. "My lawyers tried to make it fair, Elena. Don't fight it. You don't have the stomach for a fight. And honestly, you don't have the funds." Elena stood by the kitchen counter, her hands gripping the cold marble so hard her knuckles were white. She was 32, but in that moment she felt ancient. She looked at the man she had supported for 7 years. She had worked double shifts at a bakery to put him through business school. She had proofread his pitch decks until her eyes burned. She had stayed in the background, wearing department store dresses so he could buy bespoke suits, building the image of the golden boy CEO of Sterling Tech. "Is it her?" Eleanor asked. Her voice was quiet. It always was. Mark hated loud noises. Mark finally turned. His eyes, a piercing blue that once made her knees weak, were now filled with a bored pity. "It's not about another woman, Elena. It's about trajectory. Look at you." He gestured vaguely at her. She was wearing a paint-stained cardigan and jeans. She had spent the day refinishing an antique chair she'd found on the curb, a hobby he called trash collecting. "You're stagnant," Mark said, sighing as if explaining taxes to a child. "I'm scaling up. We're about to go public. I need a partner who fits the room, Elena. Someone who can navigate a gala, not someone who smells like sawdust and turpentine. You're small. You've always been small. I need big." The words hit her like physical blows, aimed precisely at her deepest insecurities. Small, quiet, stagnant. "I paid the rent on this place for 3 months, he added, grabbing the handle of his suitcase. "After that, you're on your own. Try not to spiral, okay? It's pathetic." He opened the door. The cold wind rushed in, carrying the scent of rain and exhaust. "Mark," she said, her voice trembling. He paused, 1 foot out the door. "You're going to regret this." Mark laughed. It was a genuine, unforced sound of amusement. "Elena, look at where I'm going. Then look at where you are. The only thing I'll regret is not doing this 2 years ago." The door clicked shut. Eleanor stood in the silence of the expensive condo. She walked over to the kitchen island and looked at the papers. The settlement was insulting. A pittance, enough to survive for 6 months, maybe a year if she moved to a cheaper city. He had hidden the assets. She knew it, and he knew she knew it. But he was right about one thing. She didn't have the money to hire a forensic accountant to prove it. She walked to the window and watched him get into the waiting Uber Black. He didn't look up. Eleanor Vance slid down the cabinet doors until she hit the floor. She pulled her knees to her chest. She didn't cry. She was past crying. She felt a strange, cold sensation spreading through her chest. It wasn't heartbreak, it was the calcification of a spine she forgot she had. Small, he had called her. She looked at her hands, rough, calloused, stained with walnut stain and varnish, Hands that could take something broken, stripped and discarded and turn it into something beautiful. "Okay, Mark," she whispered to the empty room. "Watch me." The shop was tucked away on a cobblestone side street in Beacon Hill, barely wide enough for a car to pass. The sign above the door was hand-painted in gold leaf, Vance Restoration and Horology. It smelled of beeswax, old paper and ticking time. Elena adjusted the magnifying loupe over her right eye. She was working on the escapement of a 19th century French carriage clock. The mechanism was seized with decades of grime, but she was patient. Patience was her currency now. Since the divorce, Eleanor had vanished from Mark's world completely. She hadn't fought the settlement. She took the check, sold her wedding ring, and poured every cent into this shop. She lived in a studio apartment above it that was smaller than Mark's old walk-in closet, but it was hers. The bell above the door jingled. Elena didn't look up immediately. "Be with you in a moment," she called out, her voice steady. She carefully tweezed a microscopic gear into place. "Take your time," a deep voice replied. "Rush work is rarely good work." Eleanor froze. The timbre of the voice was unusual, gravelly, low, and resonant. She set her tools down and removed her loupe, turning around. A man was standing in the center of her shop. He was massive. That was the first impression, height and breadth that seemed to suck the oxygen out of the small room. He wore a charcoal overcoat with the collar turned up, damp from the relentless Boston drizzle. He held a black umbrella dripping onto her hardwood floor. But it was his face that arrested her. He was handsome, undeniably, with sharp cheekbones and dark hair graying at the temples, but there was a jagged scar running from his jawline down into his collar. He looked less like a customer and more like a thunderstorm that had taken human form. "Can I help you?" Elena asked, wiping her hands on her apron. The man stepped forward, limping slightly. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a velvet pouch. He placed it on the counter with a heavy thud. "I was told you are the best in the city for impossible causes," he said. Elena approached the counter. She opened the pouch. Inside lay a pocket watch. It was a Patek Philippe, likely from the 1920s, but it had been destroyed. The casing was crushed, the glass shattered, the hands bent like broken insect legs. "This looks like it was run over," Elena observed, looking up at him. "Thrown against a wall," the man corrected, in a moment of poor judgment. Elena looked into his eyes. They were dark, almost black, and filled with a restless exhaustion. She recognized that look. She had seen it in the mirror for months after Mark left. "It's a beautiful piece," she said softly. "Does it have sentimental value?" "It belonged to my father. It stopped working the day he died. I broke it the day I realized I was turning into him." The honesty was stark, stripping away the polite fiction usually maintained between shopkeeper and client. Elena picked up the watch, her fingers gentle on the fractured metal. "I can fix the mechanism, I can replace the crystal. But the dent in the casing, if I smooth it out completely, the metal will weaken. It might be better to leave a trace of the damage. It tells the story." The man stared at her. For a moment, the intensity of his gaze made her flush. "Leave the damage," he said softly. "I prefer honest things." He reached into his coat for a card and slid it across the glass counter. "Julian Thorne, Thorne Enterprises, no title, no phone number, just an email address." Elena's breath hitched. Julian Thorne, the recluse billionaire, the man who owned half the skyline of Boston but hadn't been photographed in 5 years. Rumors swirled about him. A tragic accident, a dead wife, a recluse living in a penthouse fortress. "It will take 3 months," Eleanor said, keeping her voice professional despite her racing heart. "Parts for this movement are rare." "Take 6, Julian said. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. He looked around the shop, taking in the quiet precision of her world. "You have a sanctuary here, Miss Vance. It's peaceful. "It's mine," she said simply. Julian nodded, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "That's the most important thing." He walked out into the rain, and moments later, Elena saw a massive black SUV pull up to the curb. Two men in suits, obviously security, flanked him as he got in. Elena looked down at the broken watch. For the first time in 2 years, she felt a spark of curiosity that had nothing to do with survival. Over the next 4 months, Julian became a fixture in her life, though in a strange, disjointed way. He would stop by every Tuesday evening just before closing. Sometimes he checked on the watch. Sometimes he brought other things, a torn first edition book, a music box that played off-key. They rarely spoke about personal things. They spoke of gears, of leather binding, of the weather. But there was a current running between them. He began to stay longer. He would sit in the wingback chair in the corner while she worked, reading a newspaper, simply existing in her silence. He never hit on her. He never flaunted his wealth. He just existed, like a large, protective shadow in the corner of her shop. One rainy Tuesday, he brought 2 coffees. "Black, no sugar," he said, handing her a cup. "I noticed that's how you drink it." Eleanor took the cup, her fingers brushing his. The electricity was palpable. "You're observant." "I have to be," Julian said darkly. "In my world, missing a detail gets you killed, or bankrupt, usually both." "Is that why you travel with bodyguards?" she asked, nodding toward the tinted window where the SUV always idled. "They aren't just bodyguards, Elena. They are containment. They keep the world out." He took a sip of coffee. "And sometimes they keep me in." He looked at her then, really looked at her, with a hunger he usually kept veiled. "You don't have anyone protecting you here," he noted. "No alarm system, just a bell on the door." "I have nothing worth stealing," Elena said with a shrug. Julian's eyes narrowed. "You are profoundly wrong about that." The piece Elena had built was shattered on a sunny Thursday morning. She was polishing a mahogany veneer when the bell jingled. She looked up, a smile ready, hoping it was Julian, though it was the wrong day. The smile died instantly. Standing in her shop, looking out of place in a navy bespoke suit that cost more than her entire inventory, was Mark. He looked good, wealthy, polished, but there was a tightness around his eyes that hadn't been there before, a frantic energy vibrating beneath the cologne and confidence. "Well," Mark said, looking around the shop with a sneer. "It's quaint. A bit dusty, isn't it?" Eleanor placed the polishing cloth down. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a PTSD response she couldn't control, but she forced her hands to remain steady. "Mark, what are you doing here?" "No hello? No, how have you been, Mark?" He walked to the counter, trailing a finger through a layer of dust on a bookshelf. "I've been better, actually. Sterling tech is booming. We're on the cover of Forbes next month." "Good for you," Elena said. "What do you want?" Mark sighed, dropping the pleasantries. "I need a signature, a formality, really." He pulled a document from his briefcase and slapped it onto the glass counter right over the spot where Julian had placed the watch months ago. "We're selling the sprawling estate in the Hamptons, the one we bought right before the split. Turns out your name is still on the deed alongside mine. Clerical error." Elena looked at the paper. "That house? You told me you sold that 2 years ago to cover the company's debts." Mark's jaw tightened. "Plans changed. I held onto it. Now the market is hot. I have a buyer lined up. 20 million. I just need you to sign a quitclaim deed. You waive your rights to the property. I sell it. Everyone moves on." Elena stared at him. She might have been small to him, but she wasn't stupid. She had read the business section. She knew Sterling Tech's stock had wobbled recently. Rumors of a failed merger. Mark needed cash. Fast. "If my name is on the deed," Elena said slowly, "then I own half that house. That's $10 million, Mark." Mark laughed, but it was a cold, barking sound. "Don't be ridiculous. You didn't pay for that house. I did. My genius, my work. You were just the decoration. You don't deserve a dime of that equity." "I supported you for 7 years," Elena said, her voice gaining strength. "I signed the original loan because your credit was maxed out. Remember?" Mark leaned over the counter. The charm evaporated, his face contorted into the ugly mask she remembered from their final days. "Listen to me, you little mouse. You're going to sign this. If you don't, I will bury you in legal fees. I will sue you for spousal support fraud. I will drag this little shop of yours through the mud until you're begging for change on the corner." He reached out and grabbed her wrist. "You are nothing. You are a failed artist living in a dusty box. Don't try to play in the big leagues." "Let go of me," Elena said, trying to yank her hand back. "Sign the paper, Elena. I'm not asking." The bell above the door didn't jingle this time. The door was pushed open with force, slamming against the wall. "I believe," a voice growled, low and terrifying like grinding tectonic plates. "The lady asked you to let go." Mark whipped his head around. Julian Thorne stood in the doorway. But this wasn't the quiet, brooding man who drank coffee in the corner. This was the Titan. He seemed to fill the entire frame of the entrance. He wasn't wearing his usual overcoat. He was in a sharp black suit that strained at the shoulders, and he wasn't alone. Behind him, visible through the shop window, the street was blocked. 2 black SUVs were parked at angles. 3 men stood on the sidewalk, large, silent, wearing earpieces. Mark sneered, though he took a half-step back, releasing Eleanor's wrist. "Who the hell are you? This is a private conversation between husband and wife." Julian stepped into the room. He moved with a predatory grace, his limp barely noticeable. He walked straight to the counter, placing himself physically between Mark and Elena. He looked down at Mark, who was 6 feet tall, but suddenly looked like a child. "Ex-wife," Julian corrected. He looked at Elena. "Are you hurt?" Elena rubbed her wrist. "I'm fine. Julian, you don't have to." "Julian." Mark's eyes widened. He looked from the scarred man to the SUVs outside. The realization hit him like a slap. "Wait, Julian Thorne, the Thorne Group." Mark's arrogance faltered. Julian Thorne was a shark that ate men like Mark for breakfast. Thorne Enterprises could buy sterling tech with petty cash. "You know who I am," Julian said, his voice devoid of emotion. "Good. Then you know I value my privacy, and you know I value my investments. Ms. Vance is currently restoring a priceless artifact for me. By threatening her, you are endangering my property." Julian picked up the quitclaim deed Mark had slapped on the counter. He read it in 2 seconds, then ripped it in half, and then in half again. "Hey!" Mark shouted, his face flushing red. "That's a legal document." "It's trash," Julian said, dropping the confetti onto the floor. "If you want Ms. Vance to sign away an asset, you will send a proper offer through her legal counsel. And since she doesn't have one, I'm appointing my personal team to represent her as of this morning." Mark looked between them. His brain was trying to compute the impossible equation, his mousy, discardable ex-wife, and the most powerful, elusive billionaire on the East Coast. "You're sleeping with him," Mark accused, a nasty smirk curling his lip. "That's it, isn't it? You found a richer sugar daddy." The air in the room dropped 10 degrees. Julian didn't yell. He didn't hit him. He simply leaned in close, his scarred face inches from Mark's. "Mr. Sterling, I suggest you leave, now, before I decide to buy the building your company leases and evict you by noon." Mark paled. He grabbed his briefcase. He looked at Elena one last time, his eyes full of venom. "This isn't over, Elena. You think he's going to save you? Men like him don't keep pets for long." Mark stormed out, pushing past Julian. He hurried down the street, looking back once to see the wall of bodyguards standing silently by the SUVs. Inside the shop, the silence stretched. Elena was trembling, the adrenaline was crashing. Julian turned to her. The terrifying intensity vanished, replaced by a look of profound concern. He reached out, his large hand hovering near her shoulder but not touching, as if afraid he might break her. "Did he hurt you?" Julian asked. "No," Elena whispered. He scares me. He has so much power, Julian. He can ruin me." Julian shook his head. He walked to the window and flipped the sign to closed. "He has no power, Elena. He's a boy playing with matches." Julian turned back to her, his dark eyes blazing. "And he is never getting near you again." "Why?" Elena asked, tears finally spilling over. "Why are you doing this? I just fix your clocks." Julian walked over to her. He took her hand, the one Mark had grabbed, and gently ran his thumb over the red mark forming on her skin. "Because," Julian said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name yet, "you are the only person in this city who looked at my scars and didn't flinch. You fix broken things, Elena, even the ones that don't deserve it." He pulled out his phone and typed a quick message. "Pack a bag," he said. "What?" "He's desperate. Men like that are dangerous when they're cornered. You're not staying above the shop tonight." "I can't just leave." "Elena," Julian said, and for the first time he used her name with a possessive weight. "My security detail is already securing the perimeter. You are coming to the estate. You'll be safe there." Eleanor looked at the man who had been a shadow in her shop, now standing as a fortress between her and the world. She looked at the torn paper on the floor. "Okay," she whispered. The drive to Julian's estate was silent, a smooth glide through the rain-slicked streets of Boston in a heavily armored SUV. Elena sat in the back, the leather seat cool against her legs. Beside her, Julian stared out the tinted window, his jaw set in a line of grim determination. They didn't head to the suburbs. Instead, the convoy turned toward the Seaport district, pulling up to the entrance of the Meridian, a glass needle of a skyscraper that pierced the low-hanging clouds. "You live here?" Elena asked, looking up at the vertiginous height. "The top 3 floors," Julian murmured as the heavy steel gates of the private garage rolled open. "It's quiet." The ascent in the private elevator was ear-poppingly fast. When the doors slid open, Elena wasn't greeted by a home, but by a cavern. The penthouse was the expanse of obsidian stone, floor-to-ceiling glass, and stark, brutalist furniture. It was breathtaking, commanding a view of the entire harbor, but it was also cold. It felt less like a living space and more like a strategic command center. "Make yourself at home," Julian said, removing his suit jacket and tossing it onto a charcoal sofa. "Though I apologize, it's not cozy." Elena walked to the window. The city looked like a circuit board from up here. "It's lonely," she said, before she could stop herself. Julian froze halfway to the kitchen. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. Safety often is. He poured 2 glasses of amber liquid, aged whiskey, and brought one to her. "My security team has already swept your shop. They'll monitor it 24/7. If Mark or anyone he hires goes near it, we'll know." Eleanor took the glass, her hands trembling slightly. The adrenaline from the confrontation was fading, replaced by a bone-deep exhaustion. "Who hurt you, Julian?" she asked softly. "You live in a fortress. You have an army. You look at the world like it's trying to break in." Julian took a long sip of his drink. He walked over to the fireplace, a long strip of gas flames dancing over black rocks, and stared into it. 10 years ago, I wasn't a recluse," he began, his voice gravelly. "I was like Mark, maybe worse, arrogant, loud. I built Thorn Enterprises by crushing competitors. I had a wife, Sarah. She was gentle, like you." Eleanor held her breath. "We were carjacked in Rio, a kidnapping attempt for ransom. The security was lax because I was too cheap to pay for the best. I thought I was untouchable." He touched the jagged scar on his neck. "I fought back. It was stupid. The driver panicked. The car went off a bridge. The silence in the room was heavy, suffocating. I survived," Julian whispered. Sarah didn't. The scar isn't from the crash, Elena. It's from the surgery to reconstruct my throat so I could breathe again. Every time I look in the mirror, I don't see a survivor. I see the man whose arrogance got his wife killed. He turned to her. The vulnerability in his eyes was devastating. That is why I hide. That is why I have the bodyguards. Not to protect myself from the world, but to protect anyone I care about from me, from my mistakes. Eleanor set her glass down. She crossed the vast room, the distance between them feeling like a canyon she had to bridge. She stopped in front of him. Without a word, she reached up. Julian flinched, expecting judgment, but Eleanor's hand settled gently on his cheek, her thumb grazing the edge of the scar. "You aren't him," she said firmly. "Mark destroys people to build himself up. You built walls to keep people safe. That's not arrogance, Julian. That's love. Heavy, painful love." Julian closed his eyes, leaning into her touch for just a fraction of a second before pulling back, as if burned. He wasn't ready for forgiveness. "Get some rest," he said hoarsely. "The guest suite is down the hall. Tomorrow we deal with Mark. And Elena, in this house you are not a guest. You are under my protection. Ask for anything, and it is yours." He turned and walked into the shadows of his study, leaving Elena standing in the glow of the city lights, realizing that the beast in the tower wasn't a monster at all. He was just a man bleeding from an old wound, waiting for someone brave enough to stitch it up. The next morning, the war began not with a bang, but with a notification ping on Elena's phone. She was sitting at the massive marble island in Julian's kitchen, drinking coffee that a silent staff member had prepared. Sunlight flooded the room, making the stark modernism feel a little warmer. She unlocked her phone and felt the blood drain from her face. Trending in Boston. Gold digger Vance. She clicked the link. It was an article on a popular gossip site, but the source was clearly planted. The Secret Life of the Ex-Mrs. Sterling. How a failed artist drained tech CEO Mark Sterling's accounts before running into the arms of a recluse billionaire. The article was a masterpiece of fiction. It claimed Eleanor had been unfaithful. It claimed she had a gambling addiction that drained their savings. It painted Mark as the long-suffering genius victimized by a parasitic wife. And the kicker? A grainy photo taken yesterday through the window of her shop, showing Julian standing close to her, looking aggressive. The caption read, "Elena Vance's new benefactor threatens her ex-husband." "He's twisting it," Elena whispered, her hands shaking. "He's twisting everything." Julian walked into the kitchen. He was dressed in a casual grey sweater and slacks, looking less like a titan of industry and more like a man at home. But the moment he saw her face, his expression hardened. "Don't read it," he commanded gently, taking the phone from her hand and placing it face down. "Everyone will believe him," Elena said, her voice rising in panic. "He's charming, Julian. He's on TV. I'm nobody. I'm just the woman who works in a dusty shop. They're calling me a gold digger." "Let them talk," Julian said calmly. He walked to the refrigerator and poured himself a glass of water. Noise is the weapon of the weak. Mark is making noise because he has no ammunition. He has the press. And I have the truth. And more importantly, Julian turned, his dark eyes gleaming with a dangerous intelligence, I have the receipts. He pressed a button on the wall panel. Protocol 4, the war room. A section of the wall in the living area slid back, revealing a bank of monitors. Elena gasped. It looked like something out of a spy movie. "My team has been busy since yesterday," Julian explained, gesturing to the screens. "Mark claimed he needed you to sign that deed because of a clerical error. That was a lie. Look." He pointed to a document on the center screen. "Mark Sterling is under investigation by the SEC for inflating his subscriber numbers ahead of the IPO. He's desperate for liquidity to cover a margin call on a personal loan he took out to prop up the stock price. The loan is collateralized by the Hamptons estate. Elena blinked, trying to process the financial jargon. So, if he doesn't sell the house, he defaults on the loan, Julian finished. The bank seizes his assets, the SEC investigation triggers, the IPO collapses, he loses everything. He didn't come to your shop to bully you, Elena. He came because you are the only thing standing between him and prison. Elena stared at the screen. The man who had called her small was currently dangling over a precipice, held up by a single thread. Her signature. He needs me, she realized. A strange laugh bubbled up in her chest. He needs the mouse to save him. Precisely, Julian said, and that gives us all the leverage. So what do we do? Release this info? Not yet, Julian said. If we leak the SEC investigation now, the house value tanks, and your half of the equity becomes worthless. I won't let you lose your money, Eleanor. We're going to play him. Julian walked over to her. He looked intense, revitalized. Helping her was bringing him back to life, waking up the brilliant strategist who had been dormant for a decade. Tonight is the Sterling Tech Future Gala, Julian said. Mark is expecting to be crowned King of Boston. He thinks you're cowering in a hole, crying over these articles. He thinks he's won. Julian picked up a heavy cream envelope from the counter. It was an invitation. He sent this to the shop this morning. A mockery. He wants you to see him shine. Elena looked at the invitation. Mark Sterling invites you to witness the future. I can't go, Elena said, shrinking back. The press will be there. They'll tear me apart. Julian stepped into her space. He didn't touch her, but his presence was encompassing. They won't touch you, he vowed, because you won't be walking in as Mark Sterling's ex-wife. You'll be walking in as my partner. Eleanor's eyes went wide. You? You haven't been to a public event in 10 years. The papers call you the ghost of Beacon Hill. Then it's time for a haunting, Julian said. Elena, you spent 7 years in the shadows so he could shine. Tonight we flip the switch. You are going to walk into that ballroom and you are going to look like the queen you are. And I will be right beside you, daring anyone to say a word. He held out his hand. Will you do this? Will you stop hiding? Elena looked at her calloused hands. She thought of Mark's sneer. You're small. She looked at Julian, a man terrified of the world, willing to walk into the fire for her. She took his hand. Let's burn it down, she said. The preparation was a military operation disguised as a beauty ritual. Julian didn't just hire a stylist. He hired a team. They descended on the penthouse suite with racks of clothes, cases of jewelry, and an air of serious business. No pastels, Elena told the stylist, holding up a pale pink dress that reminded her of the outfits Mark used to pick for her. I don't want to look soft. Understood, the stylist said. She pulled out a gown from the back of the rack. It was midnight blue velvet, almost black, strapless with a plunging neckline that was architectural and daring. It was a dress that demanded attention, not requested it. When Elena stepped out of the dressing room hours later, the transformation was absolute. The dress hugged her curves like a second skin, the dark velvet contrasting with her porcelain skin. Her hair, usually tied back in a messy bun, fell in cascading waves of chestnut over one shoulder. Her makeup was sharp, winged eyeliner, a deep berry lip. She looked dangerous. She walked into the living room where Julian was waiting. He was wearing a tuxedo. It was bespoke, cut to accommodate his broad shoulders perfectly. He was adjusting his cufflinks, his back to her. I'm ready, Eleanor said. Julian turned. His hands stilled on his cuffs. His eyes swept over her, from the hem of the gown to her eyes. He didn't say anything for a long moment. He simply stared, as if he had never seen a woman before. You look... Julian's voice caught. He cleared his throat. You look formidable, Elena. He walked over to a side table and picked up a velvet box. I have something for you. The stylist suggested diamonds, but I thought this was more appropriate. He opened the box. Inside lay a necklace. It wasn't a delicate chain. It was a statement piece, interlocking links of platinum and sapphires, structured and heavy. "It's beautiful," Elena breathed. "Turn around," he murmured. She turned, sweeping her hair off her neck. She felt his warm fingers brush her skin as he fastened the clasp. His breath hitched slightly against her ear. The intimacy was electric, far more potent than anything she had ever felt with Mark. Mark had touched her with possession. Julian touched her with reverence. "This necklace," Julian said, his voice low near her ear, "was commissioned for my mother. She wore it to board meetings when she took over the company in the 80s. She called it her war paint." He placed his hands on her bare shoulders, his thumbs tracing the collarbone. Elena leaned back against him slightly, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You aren't wearing this to look pretty for him, Elena. You're wearing this to show him that he didn't break you, that you are made of stronger material than he could ever comprehend." He stepped back, offering his arm. "Shall we?" Elena took his arm. It felt like gripping a steel bar. "I'm scared," she admitted. "Good," Julian said, leading her toward the private elevator. "Fear keeps you sharp. But remember one thing." "What?" "Tonight, you are the one with the bodyguards. You are the one with the billions in leverage. You are the one who holds his fate in your hand." Julian's face darkened with a fierce protectiveness. "Tonight, Mark Sterling learns that he is not the predator, he is the prey." The Sterling Tech Gala was held at the Boston Public Library, the grand courtyard transformed into a glittering arena of wealth and ambition. Cameras flashed like strobe lights at the entrance. Mark Sterling was in his element. He stood near the entrance, holding court. He was wearing a white tuxedo jacket, a choice meant to highlight his purity and vision. He was laughing, clutching a glass of champagne, flanked by board members and a tall blonde model who looked bored. "The numbers are solid," Mark was saying loudly to a reporter. "We're revolutionizing the industry. And frankly, shedding the dead weight in my personal life has allowed me to focus entirely on the future." The reporter scribbled that down. "So the rumors about your ex-wife causing trouble?" "Sad, really," Mark said, putting on a face of faux sympathy. "Some people just can't handle being left behind. I wish her the best, truly, even if she is unstable." Suddenly, the ambient chatter in the room dropped. It started near the doors, a hush that spread like a wave across the crowd. The flashes of the cameras stopped, then erupted with 10 times the intensity. Mark frowned. "What is that? Is the senator here?" He turned toward the grand staircase. His glass of champagne slipped from his fingers and shattered on the marble floor. Standing at the top of the stairs was Elena. She looked 10 feet tall in the midnight velvet, the platinum collar gleaming under the chandeliers. She didn't look unstable. She looked like a goddess of vengeance. But it wasn't just her. Beside her, his hand resting protectively on the small of her back, was Julian Thorne, the ghost, the recluse, the man who hadn't been seen in a decade, and flanking them were 6 men. Massive, identical dark suits, earpieces. They moved in a phalanx, creating a literal wall of muscle around the couple. "Is that Julian Thorne?" someone whispered. "My God, look at her," another voice said. "Is that the ex-wife?" Elena looked down at the sea of faces. She found Mark instantly. She saw the shock on his face, the fear dawning in his eyes as he realized who was standing next to her. Julian leaned in, his lips brushing her ear, loud enough for the nearby press to catch the intimacy. "Head up, Elena. Smile. It's the deadliest thing you can do." Elena smiled. It wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a woman who had just lit a match and was watching the bridge burn. They began to descend the stairs. The crowd parted like the Red Sea. The bodyguards moved with precision, pushing back the paparazzi, creating a sacred circle of space around them. Mark stood frozen, the shattered glass around his shoes. He looked at the blonde model next to him, then at Elena. The comparison was brutal. He had traded a diamond for a rhinestone, and the whole city could see it. Eleanor stopped 3 feet from Mark. The bodyguards formed a semicircle behind her, blocking anyone from approaching from the rear. "Hello, Mark," Eleanor said. Her voice was calm, carrying easily in the silent room. "Thank you for the invite. You were right. I really shouldn't miss the future." She glanced at Julian. Julian looked at Mark with cold, dead eyes. "Hello, Sterling. Nice tuxedo. Shame about the mess on your shoes," Mark stammered. "Julian, I didn't know you knew Elena this well." "There is a lot you don't know," Julian said. "Like the fact that my legal team just filed an injunction against the sale of your Hamptons property and sent a packet of very interesting documents to the SEC regarding your loan applications." Mark's face went grey. You can't do that here. This is my night." "Was," Eleanor corrected softly. She took a step closer, invading his space, the sapphires at her throat catching the light. "It was your night, Mark. Now it's just a countdown." She leaned in, whispering so only he could hear. "You wanted big, Mark. You wanted someone who fits the room. I own the room now." She stepped back, took Julian's arm, and turned away. "I'm bored," she said to Julian, loud enough for the press to hear. "Take me somewhere real." "As you wish," Julian said. As they walked away, leaving Mark standing in the wreckage of his ego and his champagne, the cameras went wild. But Mark wasn't looking at the cameras. He was looking at the wall of bodyguards, moving in perfect synchronization, protecting the woman he had thrown away. He realized then, with a sick feeling in his gut, that he hadn't just lost a wife. He had started a war with a superpower, and he was already out of ammo. Mark Sterling was not a man who handled failure well. In his world, failure was a theoretical concept that happened to other people. People who didn't have Ivy League degrees and 7-figure trust funds. But as he sat in his stripped-down office 3 days after the gala, failure wasn't just theoretical. It was the FBI agents waiting in the lobby. The gala had been a catastrophe. The photos of Eleanor, looking regal, untouchable, and draped in the Thorne family sapphires, were everywhere. The headlines had shifted from gold digger to the Queen of Beacon Hill. The narrative had flipped. Mark wasn't the victim. He was the fool who let a goddess go. Worse, the investors had pulled out. The injunction on the Hamptons house had frozen his assets. The margin call had triggered. He was hours away from total insolvency. "Mr. Sterling," his assistant said, her voice trembling over the intercom, "the agents are insisting on coming up. They have a warrant. Stall them. Stall." Mark screamed, throwing a crystal paperweight against the wall. It shattered, much like his life. He grabbed a bottle of scotch from his desk drawer and took a swig. His eyes were bloodshot, his tuxedo shirt from the other night still unwashed and wrinkled on the floor where he'd slept. He blamed Julian Thorne, the monster, the freak with the scar. Mark logged into the dark web forum he had been scouring for the last 24 hours. He had spent his last liquid cash, $50,000 hidden in a crypto wallet, on information. Not corporate espionage. Something darker. He had found a name. Carlos Mendoza. The man who had driven the car in Rio 10 years ago. The man who had betrayed Julian Thorne. Mendoza wasn't in jail. He was dead. But the police report Mark had purchased contained a detail that the public didn't know. A detail about how Julian had survived while his wife died. A detail that could break a man psychologically if used at the right moment. Mark didn't want to win anymore. He knew he couldn't win. He just wanted to hurt them. He pulled a small, heavy object from his desk drawer. A snub-nosed .38 special he had bought for home protection years ago and never fired. "You think you're safe in your tower, Elena?" Mark whispered, his voice slurring. "You think he can save you? Let's see how the monster reacts when history repeats itself." He slipped out the private fire exit just as the elevator doors dinged and the FBI agent stepped onto the floor. Mark Sterling was gone, and he had nothing left to lose. It was foolish, Elena knew, to go back to the shop, but she had left the Patek Philippe on her workbench. The replacement crystal had finally arrived from Switzerland that morning, delivered to the penthouse, and she couldn't rest knowing the watch was unfinished. It felt like a bad omen to leave it broken. "It's a quick stop," she had promised Julian. "In and out, 10 minutes. Julian hadn't liked it, but he had a board meeting he couldn't miss, ironically to finalize the acquisition of a bankrupt tech company that turned out to be Sterling Tech's biggest rival. "Take the full detail," Julian had ordered. "Do not unlock the door for anyone." Now, Elena stood in the quiet of her shop. The rain was hammering against the glass, blurring the world outside. 2 massive SUVs were parked out front, the engines idling. 4 bodyguards stood on the sidewalk, creating a perimeter. 2 more were inside with her, standing by the door like statues. She felt safe. She felt protected. She sat at her bench, the loop in her eye. She carefully set the crystal into the bezel of Julian's father's watch. It snapped into place with a satisfying click. She wound the mechanism. Tick, tick, tick. The heartbeat of the watch returned, strong, steady. "It's done," she whispered, smiling. She rubbed her thumb over the dented casing she had left intentionally imperfect. Honest things. Suddenly, the lights in the shop flickered and died. "Power cut," one of the bodyguards said instantly, his hand moving to his earpiece. "Alpha 1 to base. We have a blackout. Engaging backup protocols." "It's just the storm," Elena said, standing up. "Ma'am, step away from the window," the guard commanded, his voice urgent. A crash shattered the silence, not from the front, but from the back. The heavy steel security door in the alleyway, which should have been impenetrable, groaned under a massive impact. "Breach at the rear," the guard shouted. Before they could react, the rear door flew open. It hadn't been kicked. It had been rammed by a truck. Debris flew everywhere. Through the dust, a figure stumbled in. It was Mark. He was wet, wild-eyed, and waving a gun. "Nobody move!" he screamed. "I'll kill her! I swear to God, I'll kill her!" The bodyguards in the room drew their weapons instantly, training them on Mark's chest. "Drop the weapon!" the lead guard bellowed. "Drop it now!" "Back off!" Mark grabbed Eleanor, who had frozen near the counter. He hooked his arm around her neck, pressing the cold barrel of the gun to her temple. The smell of stale alcohol and desperation coming off him was suffocating. "Mark, please," Eleanor choked out. "You don't have to do this." "Shut up!" Mark screamed. "He took everything, my company, my reputation, my house. Now I take his prize." The front door chimed. Mark spun Eleanor around, using her as a human shield. Julian Thorne stood there. He had arrived. He wasn't wearing a coat. He was soaked to the bone, his chest heaving. He must have run from the car. He looked at the scene, the guns, Mark, the terror in Elena's eyes, and his face went terrifyingly blank. "Let her go, Mark," Julian said. His voice was so quiet it was almost lost under the sound of the rain. "You stay back," Mark yelled, pressing the gun harder against Elena's skin. "I know about you, Julian. I know about Rio." Julian didn't flinch. He took a slow step forward. "I know you chose," Mark shouted, a manic grin spreading across his face. "The police report said the driver gave you a choice. You could save your wife, or you could save yourself. And you hesitated. That's why she died. You hesitated." Eleanor felt Julian's gaze flick to hers. For a second, she saw the old agony flare up, the guilt that had built his fortress. "That's a lie," Julian said softly. "I didn't hesitate. I fought, and I lost." "You're a coward," Mark shrieked. "And now you're going to watch another one die." Mark's finger tightened on the trigger. "Elena," Julian said, locking eyes with her. "Do you trust me?" "Yes," she whispered. "Duck." Elena didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. She dropped her dead weight, collapsing her knees and pulling Mark's arm down with her. In the split second that Mark was off balance, the air filled with a sharp, compressed thwip sound. Mark screamed, dropping the gun. He clutched his shoulder, where a tranquilizer dart was protruding. Julian hadn't come alone. He hadn't just brought bodyguards. He had brought snipers. As Mark staggered back, the shop windows exploded inward, not from gunfire, but from the sheer force of the entry team. "Go! Go! Go!" The room was suddenly filled with black-clad figures. They didn't just enter, they swarmed. 4 men tackled Mark before he hit the ground, pinning him to the floorboards. 3 others surrounded Elena. They didn't touch her. They formed a literal human wall around her, shields raised, bodies interlocked, a cage of flesh and Kevlar. "Secure! Package is secure!" Eleanor looked through the gaps in the wall of men. She saw Julian walking toward her. He pushed through his own security team like they were made of paper. He reached the inner circle. The guards parted for him. Julian dropped to his knees on the floor, ignoring the glass shards digging into his suit pants. He grabbed Elena's face in his hands, his eyes frantic, scanning her for injuries. "Did he hurt you?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Elena, look at me. Did he hurt you?" Elena was shaking, the adrenaline crashing through her system. She reached up and touched his wet hair. "I'm okay," she sobbed. "I'm okay. You came." Julian pulled her into his chest. He buried his face in her neck, and for the first time, the Titan of Boston, the man of stone, shook with unrestrained emotion. "I will never," he swore into her hair, "let anyone touch you again." Across the room, Mark was being dragged out in handcuffs, screaming obscenities that faded into the wail of approaching sirens. Elena looked over Julian's shoulder at the counter. The Patek Philippe sat there, ticking away the seconds. The time of fear was over. 3 months later, the spring sun was finally warming the cobblestones of Beacon Hill. The scandal had been the talk of the nation for weeks, the Sterling crash. Mark Sterling was currently awaiting trial for attempted murder, kidnapping and massive securities fraud. The photos of his arrest, dragged out of a clock shop while Julian Thorne carried his ex-wife to a waiting limousine, had become iconic. But inside the penthouse at the Meridian, the world was quiet. Eleanor stood on the balcony, looking out at the harbour. She wasn't wearing a ball gown. She was wearing one of Julian's oversized shirts and holding a mug of tea. She heard the sliding door open behind her. Julian stepped out. He looked different. The tension that used to hold his shoulders up around his ears was gone. The scar was still there, but he no longer angled his body to hide it. "The lawyers just called," Julian said, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind and resting his chin on her shoulder. Mark accepted the plea deal. 20 years, no parole. Eleanor leaned back into him. "It's over." "It's over," Julian agreed. He turned her around to face him. "I have something for you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the velvet pouch. He handed it to her. Elena opened it. It was the Patek Philippe. "You fixed it," Julian said softly. "That night. Amidst all the chaos, you finished the job." "I promised I would," Elena said. "I kept the dent, though, like we discussed." Julian took the watch from her and placed it on the railing. "I don't want the watch, Elena." "But it was your father's. It belongs to the past. It belongs to a man who was broken." Julian took her hands. "I want to start time over. With you." He reached into his other pocket. This time there was no velvet pouch. There was a small, ring-sized box. Elena's breath caught. "I told you once that I built these walls to keep people safe from me," Julian said, his dark eyes vulnerable and open. "But you climbed them. You didn't bring a ladder. You brought patience. You sat in the silence with me until I remembered how to speak." He opened the box. Inside was not a diamond. It was a custom ring, the band made of brushed titanium, and set into it was a small, intricate gear from a watch movement, tiny, golden and perfect, encased in sapphire glass. "A gear," she whispered, tears pricking her eyes. Because we work together, Julian said. Because without you, the mechanism doesn't move. Elena Vance, will you marry me? Will you fill this empty fortress with noise and paint and sawdust? Elena looked at the man who had once terrified her, the man who had summoned an army to save her, and saw only the gentle soul who liked his coffee black and his silence shared. Yes, she said. Yes, Julian. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He kissed her then, a kiss that tasted of whiskey and rain and redemption. Below them, the city of Boston continued to churn, filled with people rushing, fighting and climbing. But up here, in the glass fortress that had become a home, time stood still. They weren't the billionaire and the clockmaker anymore. They were just two broken things, repaired and ticking in perfect sync. The gala this year was hosted by Thorne and Vance Foundation. The ballroom was packed, the flashbulbs were blinding. But this time, Eleanor didn't need a phalanx of bodyguards to walk down the stairs. She walked down holding Julian's hand. She was pregnant, 6 months along, radiating a happiness that made the photographers lower their cameras for a moment just to stare. They moved through the crowd, not as untouchable gods, but as partners. "Mrs. Thorne," a reporter shouted, "any comment on the new art wing opening at the Children's Hospital?" "It's open to everyone," Elena said, smiling, "especially those who need a quiet place to heal." They reached the exit. The heavy doors swung open, revealing the cool night air. "Ready to go home?" Julian asked, adjusting her wrap around her shoulders. "More than ready," Elena said. They walked toward the waiting car. The bodyguards were still there, of course. The world was still a dangerous place. But as Elena looked at their reflections in the car window, Julian's hand on her stomach, her head on his shoulder, she knew the truth. The strongest protection wasn't the men with the earpieces or the armored glass. It was the promise they had made to each other, to never let the silence become lonely again. The door closed. The car pulled away. And the story of the girl who was nothing and the man who had everything began its best chapter yet. And that is how the mouse tamed the monster. Mark Sterling is sitting in a cell wondering where it all went wrong, while Elena and Julian are building a dynasty based on love, loyalty, and a little bit of high-grade security. If you loved this story of redemption and revenge, make sure to smash that like button. Did you like how Mark got what he deserved? Let me know in the comments if you want more billionaire romance stories with a dark twist. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a story. Thanks for watching.